Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Warp Core Podcast. I'm UrzaMaster. Joining me as always, Lord Uther and Fert Derby today. Gentlemen, welcome, welcome.
Hello,
Fert Derby, I see. Maybe are we borrowing Jedi Master Cilia Moss
I
from the
have
Graying Jedi? Because I
I've
see a
given,
title right there. It says Jedi Master Cilia Moss. Jedi Master, welcome to the Warp Core.
oh,
Finally,
good Lord,
you have
man.
figured it out
I am
that this.
bifurcated. I am
Yes. Anytime we can have a guest on, this is the time. So
half
thank you,
human,
Jedi
Of
half
Master.
course.
Jedi. So I'm just like
Yeah.
Spock. I'm struggling.
Well, gentlemen, today we dive deeper into Season 2 of the original series of Star Trek with A Private Little War. And let us begin by saying this war turns out to neither be private nor little. Silimas and or Fert Derby, why not give us a little background into this interesting little encounter with the Yeti story?
Aha. Thank you, Ursa Master. Thank you, Lord Uther. And thanks to you, Star Trek fans and Graying Jedi fans who have followed me over into this weird crossover that we're doing now. You've always enjoyed it when, like, Gilligan's Island met the Harlem Globetrotters. Well, here we are now in our very own pending rebrand, massive guest star appearance for Sweeps Week. And we're talking A Private Little War, which first aired on February 2nd, 1968. We have returning champion Mark Daniels. Now that Joseph Pevney has signed off as a director, he and Mark Daniels, of course, were tied with the most number of original series episodes at 14. And Mr. Pevney signed off with the Immunity Syndrome. That was his final casting call. We still have a couple of Mark Daniels to go, and this was one of them. And then for the writer actually was Don Ingalls. And we're going to talk about Mr. Ingalls briefly in a moment. But he took a pseudonym as Judd Crucius for this episode. And we're also going to talk about that in a moment. Gene Roddenberry, the great bird in the sky himself, bird of the galaxy, he gets the final writing credit for A Private Little War. And we're going to talk about that right now. Gene, or Don Ingalls, was a lifelong friend of Gene, and they met when they were both working in the LAPD. And we covered their friendship and their relationship for the first episode that Don Ingalls wrote, and it's one of Lord Uther's favorites from season 1. The Alternative Factor was Don Ingalls' first episode for this show. And we covered that extensively in Warp Core 42, so make sure you're checking out the archives, because I guarantee you, just to hear Lord Uther's analysis of that episode, it truly will last you a lifetime. So yes, Mr. Ingalls, he kind of set the bar low initially, in our estimation, and he could only go up. And sure enough, we got our second bite of the apple, which was also covered on the Warp Core, but Don Ingalls had nothing to do with that episode. With this one, and this was supposed to be, when it was turned in, when Ingalls turned in his draft, it was a direct allegory of U.S. involvement in Vietnam. And this is why this is important, gentlemen, because we're in 1968, right? The city of Hue has not even fallen yet in a surprise North Vietnamese attack on basically the Vietnamese Asian New Year. This war is going on, and people are protesting, and soldiers are dying, and governments are twisting themselves up in pretzels to continue justifying their involvement. Right now, while this episode of Star Trek is beamed into your living rooms on February 2nd. So what we have here is this rare, almost real-time critique of this conflict that has captured the world's attention and headlines and so on and so forth. This isn't Francis Ford Coppola doing Apocalypse Now in 1979, 4 years after the fall of Saigon, or John Rambo refighting the conflict in 1985's Rambo First Blood Part 2, and so on and so forth. This is happening while it's going on, so it's a raw wound in the American psyche, in the Vietnamese psyche, and And for that, this episode deserves a little bit special consideration because network television probably didn't want to touch this with a 10-foot pole outside of Walter Cronkite in the news. And for a ostensibly a family-forward science fiction show that aims to entertain, educate, and just, excite, this one was coming in with sort of a direct allegory messaging, something that we would normally attribute to Gene Roddenberry and his idea of trying to paint a universal utopia where mankind has evolved and become a better version of itself. But ironically, the episode that Engels turned in was too on the nose or too direct in its critique of U.S. policy in Vietnam. And so Roddenberry spent drafts rewriting, and I won't say watering down, but blurring the direct reproach. And as a result, Engels felt betrayed by his friend, and they didn't speak for over a year after this thing was turned in, and Engels requested and received a pseudonym for his job. Again, the messaging of this episode, that's kind of where I was going to take a broad view, and then we can debate the specifics between the three of us. But the idea, again, in real time is, think of Tyree's people. I believe that was yes, Tyree is Kirk's friend. His tribe you can think of as the South Vietnamese, right? They've got bows and arrows, and they're basically just a peaceful farming, type community, being beset by the more aggressive northern hill people. And so Engels and Roddenberry's draft suggests that the only way for this conflict to balance itself out or find some way to conclusion is to make sure that both sides have an equal chance to destroy each other. And in the case of Tyree's people, it means giving them weapons and arms equivalent, if not greater, than their adversaries, the hill people. And that's fascinating because that sounds like, Lyndon B. Johnson's administration in 1968 trying to justify continued American involvement in Southeast Asia, right? I mean, the idea being we have to stay in there and make sure that they don't get wiped out. So we have to give them more of our troops, more of our weapons, more of our advisors to be able to counter that. And it's very much an argument you might make in real time back then. Now we have the benefit of decades of re-examination. I've read several books, very compelling books on the conflict, including Mark Bowden's Way, 1968. It's a terrific account of that surprise attack that basically exposed severe deficiencies in our strategies. So I speak of this knowing where the mistakes, seemingly were made, combination of ego and hubris and miscalculation and optimism, blind optimism. But they didn't have that in 68. They were right there in the fog of war. And like I say, whatever we feel about this episode's individual merits and moments, I think it's important to acknowledge how foundational this was to be able to, shrug off network censors or people in the boardroom that says, why can't we have another one of those crazy episodes with jellyfish taking over the universe, and trying to say something. And even if Roddenberry did have to tone it down for mass consumption, I think it's important to recognize what they were trying to say at the time they were trying to say it. So, I mean, obviously we had crazy creatures straight out of a Sid and Marty Krofft, Land of the Lost. We had a, let's just call it period appropriate or maybe period inappropriate examination of couple dynamics and the males versus the females, battle of the sexes, if you will, with Tyree and his junior Lady Macbeth wife, Nona. So there's a lot to digest and chew up here, gentlemen. So tell me what you thought of the Vietnam adjacent private little war.
From a historical standpoint, this is genius, truly genius. And what's kind of disturbing from a detached historical perspective, knowing the outcomes, it's predictive in a big way. While the South Vietnamese didn't have a, shall we say, witch-like figure to corrupt them, or corrupt the leadership, shall we say. Basically, not only did both sides escalate, but eventually one side was co-opted by the other. You could say there are many reasons for that, but it kind of gave you that feeling that, you know what, at some point, the side that's trying to betray Kirk here, shall we say, is going to eventually just give way to these, overmatched opponents, basically. No matter how quickly you can arm up this side, they really have no taste, no passion for this. They'd much rather find a peaceful solution. And rather than the two sides that are really fighting it out here, the Klingons, the Federation, handling their business outside of these poor folks, they decided to have a proxy war. Again, 100% Vietnam. And Kirk's logic behind not confronting the Klingons is LBJ's logic, 100%. If we took this to the Chinese or the Russians, that could easily engulf, if the Federation takes it to the Klingons, could easily engulf the entire Federation, the entire globe, in another world war or another, large-scale Federation conflict, which they vehemently don't want. So the expense of these poor villagers on both sides is preferable. Putting them in a long-term quagmire of a conflict is preferable to actually confronting the problem here, which is the Klingon interference, or the communist interference, if you will. But then they choose to interfere in the exact same manner, and it's like, well, what have we gained? Nothing. It's an incredibly vicious attack on the policies of the time, which I find just titillating. But as an episode, from a sci-fi point of view, it's exciting. You get life and death consequences with a galactic beast, an ape yeti-like creature with venom in its teeth. Kirk is saved by a mystic woman who may or may not be a villain, who of course eventually reveals herself to be a villain. There's sex appeal. There's conflict between friends, not just between Tyree and Kirk, but between Kirk and his whole crew. You get Spock questioning the logic, but also kind of going along with things. I mean, it's a really strong episode of Star Trek, even if you pull out all the Vietnam stuff. That being said, it's also a little hokey. If you think about it, the Klingons come in and show them, single-shot rifles, and all of a sudden they can operate a forge and mine for iron ore and do all these really complex things, but before they were just throwing stones at each other. I mean, it seems a little far-fetched, but again, it's Star Trek, it's sci-fi, it's the late 60s. There's not really a whole lot of, arming up the story they can do in a 22-minute, 23-minute time frame with commercials. So I think it is good for us now to look at this from a historical perspective, particularly given that this is a very, very, very common theme throughout human history, especially modern human history with the big powers playing with pawns. I mean, how often do we see a proxy war? All the time. There's one going on literally right now. I mean, and that's been true really ever since this episode came out and before. So I think the beauty of Star Trek, and we've talked about this in many episodes, which you can all see, by the way, if you head to our archives here at Pending Rebrand. Make sure to like, subscribe, and share. The beauty of Star Trek is it really does carry these lessons, these historical lessons. And Roddenberry was certainly ahead of his time when he was alive, and even today, Star Trek is very much ahead of its pace. Even though they may be commenting on current social issues, as they always have been in Star Trek. This is not a new phenomenon. For those out there who think that Star Trek was always just about silly aliens, it's also foreshadowing the future. These are human conditions, and history repeating itself is just a manner of humans being humans. Roddenberry respected that and saw that, and created essentially cautionary tales in an entertaining way for us to consider, which I think is, despite the fact that this might be a little bit cheesy or hokey of an episode, there's a lot of gravity here that he's playing with.
Anytime I can get an episode about the Prime Directive, a shirtless Kirk, shivering at times no less, and
He's cold.
some kind of a beast named Mugatu, I got some great Trek. So again, with all the historical stuff put aside, I think this is just a good classic sci-fi Star Trek story. It moves the characters forward in terms of their friendship. You get a lot of that good, McCoy, Kirk kind of thing. McCoy Kirk dynamic there. You get Kirk, having another woman that kind of falls. Well, he falls on her influence, I guess, is a little bit better. But I just find this, kind of reflecting back on this a little bit. This guy in every episode, it's a new gal. I mean, it's just something. Is that reflective of TV in that time period? Is it? I mean, can you guys help me out on that? Is this something where, like, in each episode of any other TV series, the guy is kissing some new gal? This seems a little. Is this a little risque? I mean, I don't know.
Well, I mean, James Bond, which was also durable in its popularity in the 60s. I mean, I think the network was gambling that Shatner was making a lot of hearts go aflutter on their living room couches each week. And so therefore, by inserting a new dynamic female interest, like, people could then project themselves into, oh, I'm kind of like her. Like, he would like me because I'm smart and I study science and biology.
I like that.
Thinking that he's just a stand-in for their crushes and the fan mail that I'm sure flooded Desilu and Paramount, involved with more shirtless Kirk. And get him some soup. It's cold.
Bill Shatner in the like late '60s is the luckiest guy on this planet, I think, because he's meeting a different gal every episode. I mean, holy cow! But again, I thought I was gonna walk away from my tablet multiple times. Like, that was my fear going into this episode, and I thought this was a great episode. I mean, again, it totally blew away my expectations overall. Again, taking the historical stuff out for me, but just the story itself, I was very surprised that I enjoyed it. I did.
Some quick notes we can't miss. First of all, Vasquez rocks again, but this time not having everything go off the rails and have them just run around each other and so forth. So, but once again, knowing where that location is, only about 10 minutes from where I live, and knowing how far that is from just Hollywood in general and Paramount Studios in particular, I'm just trying to imagine having to bus up, Shatner and Nimoy and DeForest Kelley, because I mean, it's about a 45-minute trip, each way and I'm just wondering, like, in the morning, if they're grumbling, like, I can't believe we're going back out here again, What is Daniels thinking? It's there's not a cloud in the sky. I'm gonna fry, and just griping as they're eating toast in the back of their rented car. But yes, we had Vasquez rocks again. Thank you, Mark Daniels. We had flintlock rifles, which, again, something out of, unless you're doing a Revolutionary War movie, this was the height of technology apparently for this planet. Spock takes one in the back. Chapel is back, and Sulu is still gone on the Green Berets. Is this picture ever going to wrap and we can get this helmsman back on the bridge where he belongs? I love Kirk snapping at the crew when Uhura and everyone are trying, and they're on the bridge, and he's like, "I did not invite a debate." And then he almost realizes, like, "Well, that was rough," and he's just like, "All right, I'm sorry." But just, I love his just turn. Like, "I did not invite a debate. You shut up." But anyways, I think Lord Uther pointed out in a very excited text at 3 a.m. my time that Mabenga is back, or rather,
so
Mabenga
cool.
is here. So you see where Strange New Worlds was able to say, "Hey, there's a character we can develop and use." Because why do we have two doctors, like blue-shirted, tunicked doctors on the? Bones McCoy can easily handle the workload, and Nurse Chapel, she's back. So, but it was nice to have Mabenga there to provide another voice, because this was a McCoy forward episode, guys. I mean, we talk about Kirk and we talk about Spock getting shot and healing himself and all of this, but DeForest Kelley got some nice work here, and kind of was driving the story forward until basically the third act, when Kirk reasserted himself and stepped in after healing from the Mugatum wound. But this was a nice piece for DeForest Kelley. He got to kind of shoulder the load there for a little bit. Tyree's wife, Lady Macbeth Jr., I mentioned, her love is like bad medicine, and bad medicine is what she needs to be able to seduce you with just medicinal herbs. It was a very
Happy
kinky.
40th anniversary to that album, by the way.
There you go. Don't make me feel old, UrzaMaster. That's for Graying Jedi. But this was the actress who played Nona was Nancy Kovac. And again, to her credit, she completely embodies, and I use that word literally, the character that was written for her. And I think we could spend an entire podcast talking about late 60s attitudes towards women and equality and everything else. I guarantee you that the Strange New Worlds cast would not revisit that particular characterization, even if they were to somehow revive Nona in a future episode. It would be a very different lens in which it was viewed. And like I say, we can point the fingers back at history and say, Gene Roddenberry, what were you thinking? But in reality, that's what it was. And so it's fascinating in a time capsule way to kind of look back and say, hey, I mean, this was okay, this was fine, and people get it. And she's a little bit of a gypsy woman, and that's how they ran with that there. I did love Scotty's "What are you doing, woman?" when Chapel is slapping Spock as he directed. I just love James Doohan's like exclamation there. And finally, some decent Klingon makeup. We're getting closer to the motion picture version that we're all familiar with here. But instead of just, they didn't even really try in Trouble with Tribbles. I felt the Klingons on that space station were remarkably human-like. But this one, at least, we're starting to get more of that alien feel with the Klingons there. And the big three all get wounded, right? Spock takes it green blood in the back. Kirk has venomous blood pouring through him through the middle part of this episode. McCoy gets grazed in the final battle. And DeForest is a trooper enough to just shrug it off. Like he's just like, hey, I'm fine.
He's like, oh.
So, I mean, he takes one there in the forearm and he barely flinches, and I figure, like, that's tough. That's a tough Southern doctor right there. And that was there. I think with Lord Uther's comment, like I say, and we'll talk about this on the Warp Core rating shortly, but I was surprised at how much I felt I got out of this versus, and I had no pre-expectations going in, but as season 2 of the original series has been, has its highs and its lows. In a few moments, I'll reveal which crest of that I think we're feeling here on this one.
An excellent segue to our Warp Core ratings. Out of 7, let's divert to Lord Uther first. How did you feel about this episode?
Now, this is going to be surprising. I'm going to give this one a 6 out of 7, and there's another reason why. I'm going to tie it back to Strange New Worlds. We have the Chapel Spock romance advancing again, where she's kind of watching over him and holding his hand. So we're seeing some of that, and just another shout out to Strange New Worlds to pick this random doctor and drop him into Strange New Worlds and give him this entire backstory. Just mind blown. And to me, it's just a good sci-fi story. Which, by the way, I felt at the end they didn't completely resolve the entire issue about if they were doing right or wrong. And I think that was whether it's historically we use the context there or just an overall ending to a show where Kirk's even questioning, I don't know if this is right, I don't know if this is wrong, but this is what we're gonna do, and it was very
ambiguous
to me, eye-opening, and just it makes the viewer say, well, which one is right and which one is wrong. And I think that's good to kind of put that back on the viewer sometimes to let them determine what they think is best. Letters, Master.
And I'm going to echo your sentiments and say 6 out of 7 as well. I was very pleasantly surprised by this episode. Having spent a large portion of my school years studying the Vietnam War, which I think in my generation was a little bit out of vogue, honestly, which is not a good thing, because it should be studied heavily. I agree with the ambiguity, especially in the time in '68. You really didn't know if we were doing the right thing or not. It felt very wrong, for sure, and I think you got that throughout this episode. And at the same time, it could have very easily been the right thing to avoid a global conflict, or in this case, a Federation-level conflict. So you develop this emotional sense with these characters, and it's playing in, of course, at the time, to what's going on in the world. What more can you ask of a sci-fi show? I mean, that's the creme de la creme. The only reason this isn't a perfect episode, I would say, is you do get kind of some cheesy, hokey predictableness out of, unfortunately, I think the lead female villain here. It just feels a little convenient. I also think the Yeti creature really didn't add anything. As interesting as it was, I knew you had to have a vehicle in the episode, right? You had to put all these characters on a collision course with each other. That was an odd way to do it, to say the least. But it doesn't make it that much less successful. But I can't be handing out perfect 7 out of 7 warp cores all the time. This is definitely an episode I would probably recommend. And I'd say, I know it sounds weird. Check this one out. It's totally worth your time. So we'll leave it off with Fert Derby today.
Well, thank you. I thought going in that the ceiling for this might have been a 5 at best. I think the added political subtext and context, I think, helps elevate this one for me to, as strong a 6 as you can get without really pushing the envelope and going all in on a 7. So I'm going to go with 6 on this one. I think it's a surprisingly moving episode when you consider the subtext and the context, because you realize that mistakes were made, and reversing them requires far more than just what one person can do. You can't change the tide of war single-handedly, and I think that ambiguity we're talking about that Lord Uther and UrzaMaster mentioned, this has probably got the bleakest conclusion in terms of how we leave it. That sends City on the edge of forever, right? Where Kirk's like, let's get the hell out of here, which was controversial in its own way because he said, let's get the hell out of here. But this episode, you don't walk away with, oh, good, the crew's back. We don't have those laughing on the bridge like, we came out of another one. This one, I think, was designed perhaps to stick with you, to stick to your ribs. And I think the more you think about it and the more you look back on it and maybe revisit it a few months down the road or a few years down the road, I think you'll find that. So despite any moments that may have just felt more like 60s sci-fi television. I think this one is, as you say, this is one of season two's heights, rather than Who Mourns for Adonis and Catspaw, which I know we're going to cover in our season two wrap-up in just a few short weeks here on the Warp Core podcast. Make sure you're tuning in, friends. You don't want to miss it.
Indeed. Make sure to like, subscribe, and share. And until then, live long and prosper.